Some bonds run deeper than time. Some connections survive years of separation. At a dusty sheriff's auction in Wyoming, weathered ranch hand Jeremiah Pickett stood frozen, his eyes locked on a scarred sorrel horse being sold as unwanted livestock. Stolen from him 12 years ago, this horse was his last living connection to his late wife. Everyone thought the old drifter was crazy when he rushed the fence, claiming the broken-down animal was his prized stallion, Whiskey. The sheriff demanded proof. Jeremiah had none, no papers, no brand, no witnesses. But what happened next would silence an entire auction yard and prove that some reunions transcend all logic. How did they recognize each other after a decade apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before the auction, Jeremiah "Old Bones" Pickett sat on the edge of a narrow bunk in a ranch hand's quarters outside Casper, Wyoming, mending a torn shirt by lantern light. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, the needle weaving through fabric with the kind of muscle memory that comes from decades of self-reliance. At 67, Jeremiah carried his years in the deep lines of his face and the silver threading through what remained of his dark hair, but his hands stayed steady, and his back, though it complained some mornings, still carried him through a full day's work. The bunkhouse smelled of old wood, leather oil, and the faint trace of tobacco smoke from men who'd passed through before him. Jeremiah had grown accustomed to temporary quarters like these, spare, functional spaces that asked nothing of him except that he leave them as he found them. He'd been drifting from ranch to ranch for the better part of 12 years now, taking seasonal work where he could find it, never staying long enough for anyone to wonder too much about his story. He finished the last stitch and bit the thread clean, holding the shirt up to the lantern to inspect his work. Satisfied, he folded it carefully and set it on the footlocker that held everything he owned. 3 changes of clothes, a bedroll, a few tools, a battered paperback or two, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a photograph. Jeremiah didn't look at the photograph often. Some nights he could go without thinking about it at all, could let exhaustion pull him under before memory had a chance to surface. But tonight, with the wind picking up outside and rattling the bunkhouse windows, he found himself reaching for it. The oilcloth fell away, and there she was, Sarah, standing in front of their ranch house with one hand shading her eyes from the sun and the other resting on the neck of a young sorrel stallion. The horse's coat gleamed copper red in the afternoon light, and Sarah wore that particular smile she saved for moments when she felt the world was exactly as it should be. Jeremiah remembered taking that photograph on a Sunday morning in late spring, maybe 20 years back. Whiskey had been 3 years old then, still growing into his frame, but already showing the intelligence and spirit that would make him special. Sarah had named the horse. Jeremiah wanted to call him something practical, copper or red, or even just horse, but Sarah insisted that a stallion with that kind of presence deserved a proper name. "He's smooth," she'd said, running her hand down the young horse's neck. Smooth as good whiskey going down on a cold night. Jeremiah had laughed and told her she wouldn't know about that, and she'd swatted his arm and said she knew enough. The name stuck. They'd been married 38 years when Sarah died. Cancer took her slow and mean, eating away at her strength month by month until there wasn't anything left but the shape of who she'd been, and those eyes that still tried to tell him everything would be all right, even when they both knew it wouldn't. Jeremiah sat with her through every treatment, held her hand through every bad night, and when the end came, he was there, whispering that he loved her and always would. That was 5 years ago. He'd tried to keep the ranch going after 50 acres outside Thermopolis that they'd built together. Nothing grand, but enough to run a few head of cattle and breed horses on the side. Whiskey was his pride, a stallion with bloodlines that traced back to some of the finest quarter horses in the state. People came from 3 counties over to breed their mares to him. Sarah used to handle the business side, keeping records and scheduling and making sure folks paid on time. Without her, Jeremiah found himself losing track of things, forgetting appointments, letting bills pile up. He might have managed anyway if the rustlers hadn't come. It happened on a moonless night in October, 7 years after Sarah's death. Jeremiah had gone into town for supplies, stayed later than he meant to at the feed store talking with some of the old-timers. When he got back, the barn door hung open and Whiskey's stall stood empty. The thieves had hit 3 ranches that night, taking the best horses from each. Sheriff tracked them as far as the state line, and then the trail went cold. The kind of people who knew how to move stolen livestock through channels that didn't leave traces. Losing Whiskey broke something in Jeremiah that Sarah's death had only cracked. The horse represented more than good bloodlines or potential income. He was the last living connection to the life Jeremiah and Sarah had built, the last creature on earth who remembered her voice, her touch, the way she'd sing to him while brushing out his mane. Without Whiskey, the ranch felt hollow. Jeremiah would walk out to the barn in the mornings and forget for a moment that the stall was empty, would reach for a halter that wasn't needed anymore. He sold the ranch 6 months later, didn't get what it was worth, but by then he didn't care much about money. He kept enough to get by and let the rest sit in an account he barely touched. Then he started moving. Ranch work came easy to him. He knew horses and cattle, could fix fence, operate equipment, handle a dozen different tasks that needed doing on any working spread. Owners liked him because he showed up on time, did good work, and didn't cause trouble. Other hands respected him, but kept their distance. Something in the way Jeremiah carried himself suggested a man who preferred his own company. He'd share a meal in the bunkhouse, might play a hand of cards if invited, but mostly he kept to the edges of things, present but apart. The job at the Double H Ranch outside Casper was typical of the work he'd been doing. Buck Hensley, who owned the spread, needed help with spring branding and fence repair. Buck was about Jeremiah's age, a solid man who'd inherited the ranch from his father and ran it with quiet competence. They'd known each other years back, before Sarah died, back when Jeremiah was still rooted to one piece of ground. "Good to see you, old bones," Buck had said when Jeremiah showed up looking for work. The nickname came from a joke somebody made decades ago about Jeremiah's lean frame, and it stuck the way nicknames do in ranch country. Could use a man who knows his way around horses, pays fair, and the bunkhouse is warm. Jeremiah took the job and settled into the rhythm of it. Up before dawn, coffee strong enough to strip paint, then out to whatever needed doing that day. The work was physical and straightforward, the kind that let his mind wander without getting too tangled up in memory. By evening, he was tired enough to sleep without dreaming much. He'd been there almost 3 weeks when Buck mentioned the auction. They were working on a section of fence along the north pasture, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire. The afternoon had turned warm, and both men had their sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening their shirts. Buck straightened from tamping dirt around a new post and pulled off his hat to wipe his forehead. "Sheriff's having an auction Saturday," Buck said, more to fill the silence than anything. "Seized livestock mostly. Some horses that'll probably go cheap if you're in the market." Jeremiah didn't look up from the wire he was stretching. "Don't need a horse." "Didn't figure you did. But sometimes there's good stock that just needs somebody to see its potential." Buck reset his hat and picked up the post-hole digger. "Might be worth a look anyway. Never know what you'll find." Jeremiah made a non-committal sound and kept working. He had no intention of going to any auction. He'd attended enough of them over the years to know they were mostly a way to move broken-down animals and equipment nobody wanted at prices that made buyers feel like they'd gotten a deal. Still, the mention of it stayed with him through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. That night, alone in the bunkhouse with the photograph in his hands, Jeremiah thought about what Buck had said. "Never know what you'll find." It was the kind of thing people said without meaning much by it, just conversation to pass the time while working. But something about it caught in Jeremiah's mind and wouldn't let go. He studied Sarah's face in the photograph, the way her hand rested so naturally on Whiskey's neck. She'd always believed in signs, in the idea that things happened for reasons, even when those reasons weren't clear right away. Jeremiah had been more practical, figured that life was mostly just one thing after another, and you did your best to deal with whatever came. But Sarah's faith in meaning had been absolute, and over the years, Jeremiah found himself wanting to believe she'd been right. Maybe going to the auction wouldn't accomplish anything. Probably wouldn't. But it gave him something to do on a Saturday, and maybe, just maybe, he'd see something worth seeing. At the very least, it would get him out of the bunkhouse for a few hours. He wrapped the photograph back in its oilcloth and tucked it away, then turned down the lantern and lay back on the narrow bunk. Outside, the wind had died down, and through the window he could see stars scattered across a clear sky. Sarah used to say the stars were proof that beautiful things could last. Jeremiah wasn't sure about that anymore, but he liked thinking she'd believed it. Sleep came slowly. Somewhere in the middle of the night, he dreamed of riding Whiskey across open country, Sarah sitting behind him with her arms wrapped around his waist, laughing as they galloped toward a horizon that never got any closer. He woke before dawn, the dream already fading, and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch coming to life around him. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a dry wind that carried dust devils across the empty lots surrounding the auction yard. Jeremiah borrowed Buck's truck and drove the 30 miles into town, arriving just as the first lots were being brought into the ring. The crowd was mostly locals, ranchers looking for work animals, dealers hoping to flip something for profit, and a handful of curious onlookers with nothing better to do. Jeremiah found a spot along the fence where he could see without being jostled and settled in to watch. The early lots went quick. A pair of draft horses that needed work but had good bones, some tack and equipment, a few head of cattle that looked serviceable enough. The auctioneer kept up a steady patter, voice rising and falling in that peculiar rhythm that turned numbers into music. Then they brought out a sorrel horse. The moment Jeremiah saw him, everything else disappeared. The horse was older, obviously scarred and thin, favoring his left foreleg slightly as the handlers led him into the ring. His coat had lost some of its shine, and there were marks on him that spoke of rough handling, but the shape of his head, the set of his ears, the particular way he held himself, despite evident mistreatment. Jeremiah's hands gripped the fence rail hard enough that his knuckles went white. It couldn't be. 12 years and hundreds of miles, the odds against it were impossible. But even as his mind tried to work through logic and probability, his heart was already certain. He knew that horse, the way he knew his own reflection. Every line, every movement, every detail that marked him as unique. Next lot is a sorrel gelding, the auctioneer announced. Seized from a property dispute. No papers, no brand. Good for pack work, or, "That's my horse." Jeremiah's voice came out louder than he intended, rough with emotion he couldn't control. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. The crowd's attention shifted from the ring to the lean, weathered man, gripping the fence like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "That's Whiskey," Jeremiah said, his voice steadier now but carrying across the sudden quiet. "That's my stallion. He was stolen from me 12 years ago." The sheriff stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a badge that caught the afternoon sun. Tom Hartley had held the position for nearly a decade, and he'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine claims and desperate attempts to get something for nothing. The old man at the fence had the look of someone who'd been living rough clothes, clean but worn, boots scuffed from hard use, the kind of weathered appearance that came from working outdoors in all seasons. "Sir, you need to step back from the fence," Hartley said, his tone professional but firm. "The auction is in progress." "You don't understand," Jeremiah said, not moving. "That horse is mine. His name is Whiskey. He was stolen from my ranch outside Thermopolis in October, 12 years back. I filed a report. You can check." "12 years is a long time," the sheriff interrupted. He'd heard variations of this story before, someone claiming an animal at auction was theirs, usually without any proof. You have papers? Bill of sale? Any documentation? Jeremiah felt the question like a physical blow. The papers had been in the ranch house, filed away in Sarah's careful system. When he sold the property, he'd boxed up what seemed important at the time, but the breeding records and registration papers for a horse he believed was gone forever hadn't made the cut. They'd probably been thrown out by the new owners or were mouldering in some storage unit he'd rented and forgotten about. No papers, Jeremiah admitted, but I know my horse. I raised him from a foal. That's Whiskey. The sheriff's expression didn't change. The horse has no brand, no identifying marks. He was seized from a property where the owner couldn't prove legal ownership. That's why he's here. He gestured toward the ring where the sorrel stood, head down, apparently uninterested in the proceedings. If you want to bid on him, you're welcome to do so. But I can't stop the auction based on an unsubstantiated claim. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. The law was the law, after all. Others looked sympathetic to the old drifter but doubted his story. 12 years was a lifetime in horse trading. Animals changed hands, moved through multiple owners, crossed state lines. The chances of this particular horse being the one this particular man lost over a decade ago seemed vanishingly small. Jeremiah looked past the sheriff to Whiskey. The horse had shifted his weight, and in profile, Jeremiah could see the scar along his left shoulder, a pale line through the copper coat where he'd caught himself on barbed wire as a 3-year-old. Sarah had doctored that wound, applying salve twice a day and talking to him in that gentle voice she used with all hurt things. The scar had healed clean, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. "Check his left shoulder," Jeremiah said. "There's a scar, about 6 inches long from barbed wire. And his right rear hoof, the frog, is shaped different, kind of lopsided. Farrier said it was from how he stood as a colt, nothing to worry about, but distinctive." Sheriff Hartley studied Jeremiah's face, trying to assess whether this was knowledge from genuine history or the kind of details any horseman might notice. "Those are things you could observe from looking at the animal. They don't prove ownership. I can tell you more." Jeremiah's voice carried a quiet desperation now. "He's got a white spot under his tail, about the size of a silver dollar. And his left ear twitches when he hears certain sounds, sharp sounds, like a hammer on metal. Spooks him because he got kicked in the head by another horse when he was young, and it affected his hearing on that side." The crowd had gone quieter now, people leaning in to hear. The specificity of Jeremiah's details gave weight to his claim, but without documentation it was still just words. The sheriff shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but bound by the requirements of his position. "Listen," Hartley said, lowering his voice so only Jeremiah could hear. "I understand you believe this is your horse, but I've got a legal responsibility here. This animal is part of a seized property auction. Without proof of prior ownership documentation, photographs, witnesses, I can't just hand him over because you say he's yours." "I don't want you to hand him over," Jeremiah said. "I just want a chance to prove it." "How?" Jeremiah didn't have an answer immediately. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to think of something that would satisfy the law while confirming what his heart already knew. He thought about the photograph in his footlocker, but it was miles away at the ranch, and even if he could produce it, a picture from 20 years ago wouldn't necessarily prove anything about this particular horse in this particular moment. Then he remembered something Sarah used to do, a small thing, almost forgotten in the avalanche of memories he carried. She'd had a way of calming Whiskey. When storms rolled through, the young horse had been terrified of thunder, would work himself into a state of panic that could be dangerous for him and anyone nearby. Sarah discovered that singing to him helped, not songs with words exactly, but a particular melody, a 3-note lullaby she'd hum over and over until his fear subsided. After Sarah died, Jeremiah had continued the practice. Whiskey was 8 years old by then, not as frightened by storms as he'd been when younger, but the sound still soothed him. Jeremiah would stand in the barn during thunderstorms, humming Sarah's melody, keeping the horse calm. It became a private ritual, a way of maintaining the connection between all three of them, man, woman, and horse, even after Sarah was gone. "Give me 5 minutes with him," Jeremiah said. "In the ring, alone. If he doesn't respond to me, if there's no recognition, then I'll walk away, and you can finish the auction." Sheriff Hartley frowned. "That's not standard procedure. Nothing about this situation is standard." Jeremiah's eyes remained fixed on Whiskey. The horse had raised his head slightly, ears forward, as if sensing the attention focused on him. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." The sheriff looked from Jeremiah to the horse and back again. The auction had already been disrupted. Letting this play out might be the quickest way to resolve things. If the old man failed to prove his connection, the sale could continue. If somehow he succeeded, well, that would require a different set of decisions. "All right," Hartley said finally. 5 minutes, but you do exactly what I say, when I say it. And if that horse shows any sign of aggression, you're out immediately." Jeremiah nodded, not trusting his voice. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline or emotion, or the weight of what he was about to attempt, he couldn't say. The sheriff opened the gate and motioned him through. The crowd pressed closer to the fence, sensing something unusual was about to happen. The normal rhythms of the auction had been suspended, replaced by the kind of tension that comes when outcomes are uncertain and stakes feel personal even to spectators. Jeremiah walked slowly toward the center of the ring, very aware of every eye watching him. The dust was thick under his boots, churned up by dozens of animals that had passed through earlier. The sorrel horse stood perhaps 20 feet away, head high now, watching this stranger approach with evident wariness. "Easy," Jeremiah said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. "Easy now." Whiskey's ears swiveled forward, tracking the sound of his voice. The horse took a half-step back, uncertain, 12 years of rough handling having taught him to be cautious around humans. His ribs showed too clearly through his coat, and there were fresh marks on his flanks that made Jeremiah's jaw tighten with anger at whoever had mistreated him. But underneath the damage and the years, Jeremiah could still see the horse he'd known, the intelligence in those dark eyes, the particular way he held his head when evaluating a situation, the small white star on his forehead that had been there since birth. "It's me, boy," Jeremiah said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's me." The horse didn't move. The crowd held its collective breath. The sheriff watched from the fence, one hand resting on the gate, ready to intervene if necessary. And Jeremiah, standing in the dust and the afternoon sun, with 12 years of loss and longing weighing on him like stones, began to hum. 3 notes, rising and falling in a simple melody that Sarah had created in a thunderstorm 2 decades ago. The sound carried across the ring, soft but clear, a lullaby for a frightened colt who was now a battered old stallion far from home. The change in Whiskey was subtle at first. His ears, which had been laid back in wariness, began to rotate forward. The tension in his body, the coiled readiness to bolt if this stranger proved threatening, eased by degrees. His head lowered slightly, and his breathing, which had been quick and shallow, steadied into something calmer. Jeremiah kept humming, not moving any closer, letting the sound wash over the horse like water over stones. The melody was simple, almost childlike in its construction, but it carried weight beyond its notes. It was the sound of safety, of comfort in darkness, of a woman's love translated into music. Sarah's voice had been better suited to it, clearer and sweeter, but Jeremiah had learned the tune well enough to reproduce it faithfully. Around the auction ring, the crowd had gone completely silent. People who'd been chattering about the disruption or checking their phones now stood transfixed, watching to see if this strange demonstration would yield anything beyond an old man's foolishness. Even the auctioneer, who'd been ready to protest the delay, found himself caught up in the moment's peculiar gravity. Sheriff Hartley leaned against the fence rail, arms crossed, his professional skepticism warring with something else, a reluctant hope, perhaps. That truth might be provable through means beyond documentation and legal procedure. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that the law, for all its necessary structure, sometimes failed to account for the deeper truths of how people and animals connected. Whiskey took a step forward, then another. His movements were slow, almost tentative, as if he were navigating through fog toward a light source whose origin he couldn't quite identify. His nostrils flared, testing the air for scent markers that might confirm or deny what his ears were telling him. The distance between horse and man contracted 15 feet, then 12, then 10. Jeremiah's eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. Not yet, not while the outcome remained uncertain. He could see details now that had been obscured by distance, the grey hairs creeping into Whiskey's muzzle, the small cuts and scrapes that marked recent mistreatment, the way the horse moved with a slight hitch in his gait that spoke of old injury or neglect. Whatever Whiskey had endured in the years since his theft, it hadn't been gentle. But there was something else, too, something that transcended the visible damage. In the horse's eyes, behind the wariness and the hardness that survival had required, Jeremiah could see a spark of the animal he'd known, curious, intelligent, capable of trust, despite having learned the cost of trusting poorly. The humming continued, unbroken, each repetition of the three-note melody both a question and an answer. "Do you remember?" "Yes, I remember." "Are you real?" "I'm real." "Can we find our way back?" "We can try." 8 feet separated them now. Whiskey had stopped advancing, as if some invisible boundary prevented him from closing the final distance. His head was fully raised, ears forward, whole body oriented toward Jeremiah with an intensity that made the watching crowd lean in collectively. This was the moment, the point where recognition would either crystallize into certainty or dissolve into the disappointment of mistaken identity. Jeremiah stopped humming. The silence that followed felt enormous, weighted with expectation. He extended his right hand slowly, palm down, fingers loose, the universal gesture of peaceful greeting between human and horse. He didn't step forward, didn't try to force contact, just offered the possibility and waited. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. The horse stood frozen, caught between instinct and memory, between the learned fear of rough handling and the ancient knowledge of a bond that had once been absolute. His eyes never left Jeremiah's face, searching for confirmation in features that were familiar but aged, weathered by the same 12 years that had marked them both. Then Whiskey's nose stretched forward, crossing that final distance, and touched Jeremiah's extended hand. The contact lasted only a second before the horse jerked back, startled by his own boldness. But that brief moment, the warm breath against Jeremiah's palm, the soft velvet of the horse's nose, the electric current of recognition that passed between them, was enough to shatter the dam that Jeremiah had built around his emotions. "It's you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "God above, it's really you." Whiskey stood perfectly still now, his whole being focused on this man who smelled and sounded and felt like home, like safety, like the time before everything went wrong. Slowly, with movements that suggested the weight of accumulated pain being carefully set down, the horse took another step forward. This time, when their contact came, it held. Whiskey pressed his head against Jeremiah's chest, the way he used to do after a long day's ride or when seeking comfort during a storm. The weight of the horse's head, the warmth of his breath through fabric, the solid reality of his presence, all of it crashed over Jeremiah like a wave he'd been bracing against for 12 years. His arms came up, wrapping around the horse's neck, and the tears he'd been holding back finally spilled over. They soaked into Whiskey's coat as Jeremiah pressed his face against the horse's shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, dusty and sweaty, and underneath it all, unmistakably familiar. His shoulders shook with the force of emotions too long denied, grief and joy and relief, all tangled together into something so powerful it left him barely able to stand. "I'm sorry," Jeremiah whispered into the horse's mane. "I'm so sorry I couldn't find you. I'm sorry for what they did to you. I'm sorry it took so long." Whiskey stood quiet and solid under the weight of Jeremiah's anguish, his own eyes half closed in something that looked like peace. His tail swished once, lazily, and he made a soft sound low in his throat, not quite a nicker, but close, a rumble of contentment or perhaps recognition that the long separation had finally ended. The crowd around the auction ring had erupted into sound. Some people were openly crying, moved by the obvious authenticity of the reunion they'd just witnessed. Others applauded, while still others stood in stunned silence, trying to process the statistical improbability of what they'd seen: a man and a horse, separated by more than a decade and hundreds of miles, finding each other through nothing more than a melody and the unbreakable bond it represented. Sheriff Hartley stood at the fence, his professional demeanor cracked by the raw emotion playing out in front of him. He'd wanted proof, something concrete and documentable that would satisfy legal requirements. What he'd gotten instead was something far more powerful and far less reducible to paperwork: the undeniable truth of a connection that transcended normal methods of verification. Jeremiah finally pulled back from the embrace, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. Whiskey nickered properly this time, a sound of greeting and belonging that cut through the noise of the crowd. The horse's eyes, which had been dull and guarded when the handlers first led him into the ring, now carried a brightness that spoke of hope rekindled. "Sheriff," someone called from the crowd, "you can't still doubt this is his horse." Hartley didn't respond immediately. He was watching Jeremiah check the horse over with practiced hands, running fingers along legs and shoulders, examining teeth and hooves with the automatic thoroughness of someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for horses. The old man moved with purpose now, his earlier desperation replaced by focused attention to the animal's condition and needs. "We need to talk," the sheriff called out, opening the gate and stepping into the ring. Jeremiah looked up from examining a cut on Whiskey's foreleg, his hand still resting on the horse's shoulder, as if afraid that breaking contact might make this all disappear. "I told you he was mine." "I believe you," Hartley said. The words hung in the air between them, simple but carrying enormous weight. Jeremiah felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since the moment he'd seen Whiskey in the ring. Belief was different from proof, and belief from the sheriff meant the possibility of keeping his horse. But believing you and being able to release the horse to you are two different things, Hartley continued, his tone apologetic. "This animal is part of a legal seizure. The property owner claims he purchased the horse legally 5 years ago from a livestock dealer in Montana. He has a bill of sale." "It's a fake," Jeremiah said flatly. "Or the dealer didn't know the horse was stolen when he sold him." "Probably true. But the current owner, or, I should say, the person we seized the horse from, he's got documentation. You don't." Hartley gestured helplessly. "I believe what I just saw, but I need something concrete to take to the judge. Something that proves this horse is the one stolen from you 12 years ago." Jeremiah's mind raced through possibilities. The photograph back at the bunkhouse might help, but as he'd thought earlier, it wouldn't prove conclusively that this particular horse was the foal in that old picture. Too much time had passed, too many changes in both the horse and the quality of the photograph. He needed something permanent, something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as coincidental. Then he remembered. "His mouth," Jeremiah said. "Inside his upper lip there's a tattoo." The sheriff raised his eyebrows. "A registration tattoo? From racing?" "No, a personal mark. I put it there myself." Jeremiah moved to Whiskey's head, running his hand gently up the horse's face. "After Sarah died, I was afraid I might, in a weak moment, I was afraid I might sell him. Money was tight, and people kept making offers. Good offers. But Whiskey was all I had left of her, and I knew if I sold him, I'd regret it the rest of my life." He positioned himself beside the horse's head, speaking softly to keep Whiskey calm. "So I marked him. Used a tattoo kit I borrowed from a friend who marked his cattle that way. put Sarah's birthday inside his lip where nobody would see it unless they looked specifically. His fingers carefully lifted Whiskey's upper lip, exposing the pink flesh underneath. There, you see? Sheriff Hartley stepped closer, squinting at the faded but still visible numbers tattooed on the delicate skin. The ink had aged, spreading slightly the way tattoos do over time, but the numbers were clear enough. The 23rd of July, 2048. July 23rd, 1948, Jeremiah said quietly. The day Sarah was born. She lived 71 years, and every one of them was a gift to me and everyone who knew her. His voice caught. I put that date on Whiskey so I'd remember what mattered, so I'd never let him go. Hartley pulled out his phone and took several photographs of the tattoo, documenting it from different angles. Then he straightened, his expression thoughtful. That's permanent identification. It's unusual, but it's legitimate. Combined with what I just witnessed, I think I can make a case to the judge that this horse should be returned to you. How long will that take? Few days, maybe a week. I'll need to file a motion, get a hearing scheduled. In the meantime, he paused, considering, the horse needs to stay in official custody, but I can arrange for temporary boarding at a facility where you'd be allowed visitation rights. You couldn't take him yet, but you could care for him, check on him. Jeremiah nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. The idea of being separated from Whiskey again, even temporarily, felt like being asked to hold his breath underwater, possible, but painful. But he understood the necessity of legal process, however frustrating it might be. There's something else, Hartley said, lowering his voice. The man we seized this horse from, name's Dale Garrett. He's not going to take this well. He's already angry about losing his animals, and if he finds out you're claiming one of them, he might cause trouble. What kind of trouble? Harassment, mostly. Maybe legal action, if he can find a lawyer willing to take his money. Garrett's got a reputation for being difficult. He was running a boarding stable that turned into a neglect situation, animals underfed, no proper veterinary care, living conditions that violated about a dozen regulations. That's why we seized everything on the property. The sheriff glanced at Whiskey. This horse was actually one of the better-kept ones, if you can believe that. Jeremiah felt fresh anger rise in his throat. The cuts and scrapes on Whiskey's body, the visible ribs, the wariness in his eyes, this was the better-kept option? He didn't trust himself to respond, so he simply nodded. I'm telling you this, so you're prepared, Hartley continued. Garrett might show up where you're staying, might call you, might try to intimidate you into dropping your claim. He's done it before with other disputes. Don't engage with him. If he contacts you, let me know immediately. I'm not dropping my claim. I didn't think you would. Just be careful and document everything. If he threatens you, if he damages your property, if he does anything that feels wrong, you call me. Hartley pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Jeremiah. My cell number's on there, day or night. Jeremiah tucked the card into his shirt pocket, then turned his attention back to Whiskey. The horse had been standing quietly throughout the conversation, occasionally nuzzling Jeremiah's shoulder or breathing warm air against his neck. Now Jeremiah ran his hands over the horse's body again, this time paying closer attention to each injury, each sign of poor treatment. The scar on the left shoulder was still there, exactly as he remembered. The right rear hoof showed the same distinctive shape he'd described to the sheriff earlier. But there were new marks too, rope burns on the legs, suggesting Whiskey had been tied too tightly or had struggled against restraints. A partially healed cut across his chest that looked like it might have come from running into something sharp. Multiple areas where the coat was rubbed thin from poorly fitted tack or lack of grooming. We'll get you right, Jeremiah murmured, more to himself than to the horse. Good feed, proper care, time to heal. We'll get you back to yourself. Whiskey's response was to rest his head against Jeremiah's shoulder again, a gesture so familiar and so long missed that it nearly undid him. For 12 years, Jeremiah had carried the weight of this loss, the guilt of having been gone when the theft happened, the frustration of a trail gone cold, the growing certainty that he'd never see his horse again. He'd learned to live with that weight, had built his life around the hole it created. Now, standing in a dusty auction ring, with his horse's breath warm against his neck, and the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, Jeremiah felt that weight begin to lift. Not entirely. There was still the legal process to navigate, still the reality of whiskey's condition to address, still the uncertainty of what would come next. But for the first time, in longer than he could measure, possibility felt larger than loss. The sheriff made arrangements by phone, speaking to someone at a boarding facility about temporary housing for a seized animal with special circumstances. The crowd had begun to disperse, though many people lingered, still talking about what they'd witnessed. Jeremiah heard snatches of conversation, never seen anything like it. That old man and his horse makes you believe in something, but he paid them little attention. His focus remained on whiskey, on cataloguing every detail of the horse's current state, on beginning the process of understanding what the years had done to both of them. They were older now, both marked by time and circumstance, both scarred in ways visible and otherwise. But the connection between them, the fundamental recognition that had survived everything the world had thrown at it, remained intact. That was something. That was everything. The boarding facility was a clean, well-maintained operation on the outskirts of town, run by a woman named Margaret Flores, who'd been working with horses for 40 years. She met Jeremiah at the gate the morning after the auction, her weathered face neutral but not unkind. "Sheriff explained the situation," she said, leading him toward the barn. "Unusual circumstances, but I've seen stranger things. Your horse is in the third stall on the left. I put him somewhere quiet, away from the other animals until he settles." "Appreciate it," Jeremiah said. He carried a small bag with basic grooming supplies he'd purchased in town, a curry comb, a soft brush, some hoof oil, and a container of the liniment he'd always used on Whiskey's legs after hard work. The familiar weight of these tools felt right in his hands, like picking up a language he'd thought forgotten, but which came back the moment he needed it. Whiskey raised his head when Jeremiah entered the barn, ears forward in recognition. The horse nickered softly, a sound that carried both greeting and something that might have been relief. In the better light of the barn, away from the chaos of the auction yard, Jeremiah could assess his condition more thoroughly. The horse had been given water and hay, both of which showed signs of having been enthusiastically consumed. Margaret clearly knew her business. The stall was clean, deeply bedded with fresh shavings, and positioned where Whiskey could see other horses without being crowded by them. But good care couldn't undo months or perhaps years of neglect. Whiskey remained too thin, his coat dull despite being cleaner than it had been yesterday. "Hey there, boy," Jeremiah said quietly, opening the stall door and stepping inside. He moved slowly, letting Whiskey come to him rather than forcing contact. The horse crossed the stall in 3 steps and pressed his nose against Jeremiah's chest, breathing deeply. "Yeah, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He spent the first hour simply standing with the horse, one hand resting on Whiskey's neck, re-establishing the physical connection between them. There was no hurry. Whatever else needed doing could wait while they remembered how to be in each other's presence. Eventually, Jeremiah began the grooming process. He started with the curry comb, working in small circles to loosen dirt and dead hair from Whiskey's coat. The horse stood quietly, occasionally shifting his weight, but otherwise relaxed in a way that suggested this routine felt familiar despite the years. Jeremiah worked methodically, section by section, letting the repetitive motion settle both their nerves. "You've been through it, haven't you?" he murmured, as his hands moved over the horse's body. Each mark told a story. Carelessness here, cruelty there, simple neglect everywhere. But you're tough, always were. Remember that time you jumped the fence into Miller's pasture? Thought you were going to get yourself killed, but you came back with nothing more than a scraped knee and a look that said you'd do it again first chance you got. Whiskey's ear swiveled back to catch the sound of his voice. The horse made a soft sound, something between a grunt and a sigh, and lowered his head so Jeremiah could reach his pole more easily. The simple trust in that gesture, the willingness to make himself vulnerable to grooming, spoke volumes about what remained between them despite the separation. They fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Jeremiah talked while he worked, filling the barn with a steady stream of words that covered everything and nothing, observations about the weather, memories of the ranch, questions about where Whiskey had been and what he'd seen, even though no answers would come. The content of the words mattered less than the sound of them, the tone that said, "You're safe now, you're known, you're home." By the time he finished grooming, Whiskey's coat had taken on a healthier sheen, and several pounds of dirt and loose hair lay scattered in the stall bedding. Jeremiah cleaned the horse's hooves carefully, checking for stones or signs of infection, then applied oil to the walls and frogs. The right rear hoof still showed that distinctive shape, the minor deformity that had marked Whiskey since his first year. "I need to get a farrier to look at you," Jeremiah said, setting down the final hoof. "Whoever trimmed these last did a poor job. You're probably not as lame as you seem, just need proper balance." He was applying liniment to Whiskey's legs, working the warming liquid into stiff joints and tired muscles, when Margaret appeared at the stall door. "You've got a visitor," she said, her tone careful. "Man named Dale Garrett. Says he owns this horse and wants to see him." Jeremiah's hands stilled. "Sheriff said he might show up. Want me to send him away?" "No." Jeremiah straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Better to deal with him now." Dale Garrett stood in the barn aisle with his arms crossed and his jaw set in hard lines. He was perhaps 50, thick through the middle with thinning hair and the ruddy complexion of someone who spent time outdoors but didn't take care of himself. His boots were expensive but poorly maintained, and he wore a belt buckle large enough to suggest he cared more about appearance than substance. "That's my horse," Garrett said without preamble, jerking his chin toward Whiskey's stall. "I got papers on him." "You have papers that say you bought a horse from a dealer in Montana," Jeremiah replied evenly. "That doesn't make him yours." "I paid good money for stolen property. That's not my problem." Garrett's face darkened. "Listen here, old man. I don't know what kind of game you're running, but you can't just show up and claim an animal because you want it. That horse has been mine for 5 years. I've fed him, housed him, paid for his upkeep." Jeremiah looked at the man for a long moment, taking in the expensive belt buckle, the boots that cost more than most ranch hands earned in a month, the attitude that suggested someone used to getting his way through bluster and intimidation. He thought about the scars on Whiskey's body, the evidence of neglect, the way the horse had been thin and frightened at the auction. "You've done a poor job of it," Jeremiah said quietly. "Horse is half-starved and covered in injuries. Whatever you paid for him, you didn't pay enough in care." You've got no right," Garrett sputtered, his face going redder. "I'm filing a complaint. With the sheriff, with the county, with whoever will listen. That horse is mine, and I'm not letting some drifter take him based on some story about a song and a tattoo that could have been put there any time." "The tattoo's been there since before you bought him," Jeremiah said. "If you'd bothered to look, if you'd cared enough to know the animal you claim to own, you'd have seen it." Garrett pointed a thick finger at Jeremiah's chest. "This isn't over. You hear me? This isn't close to over." He turned and stalked out of the barn, his boots loud on the concrete floor. Margaret watched him go, then looked at Jeremiah with concern. "He's going to be trouble," she said. "I know." Jeremiah turned back to Whiskey, who'd been standing tensely during the confrontation, ears back and eyes showing white at the edges. He laid a calming hand on the horse's neck. "But we've dealt with worse, haven't we, boy? We'll deal with this too." Whiskey pressed against him, seeking reassurance. Jeremiah provided it, standing in the quiet barn with his hand on his horse and his mind already working through what challenges might come next. The legal process would take time, and if Garrett made good on his threat to cause trouble, that time might be complicated. But Jeremiah had spent 12 years not knowing if Whiskey was alive or dead, had carried that uncertainty through countless temporary jobs and lonely bunkhouses. Whatever came next, whatever obstacles needed navigating, he'd face them. Because walking away wasn't an option. Not now, not ever again. The days developed a rhythm. Jeremiah would finish his work at Buck's ranch by late afternoon, then drive to the boarding facility to spend time with Whiskey. Buck, understanding the situation, had adjusted Jeremiah's schedule to make this possible. "Horse needs you," he'd said simply. "We'll make it work." Each visit followed a similar pattern. Jeremiah would groom Whiskey thoroughly, checking every inch of the horse's body for new injuries or signs of existing ones healing. He'd clean hooves, apply liniment to stiff joints, and simply spend time standing with him, re-establishing the bond that 12 years hadn't managed to break completely. Whiskey was improving. The regular feed and proper care were beginning to show results. His ribs didn't stand out quite so sharply, and his coat was developing a healthier shine. The wariness in his eyes was fading, replaced by something closer to the alert intelligence Jeremiah remembered. The horse no longer flinched when Jeremiah raised his hand, no longer shied from sudden movements. Memory was reasserting itself over learned fear. On the 4th day, Jeremiah brought something from the bunkhouse, a small wooden box that had traveled with him through all his wandering. Inside were letters Sarah had written over the years, notes left on the kitchen table, cards for birthdays and anniversaries, a few longer letters from the brief periods when they'd been separated by circumstance or necessity. He sat on a hay bale outside Whiskey's stall, with the box open on his lap, reading through the letters while the horse stood at the stall door, head over the gate, watching. Some of the letters made him smile. Sarah's sense of humor had been gentle but present. Her observations about ranch life and neighbors, often sharp and always kind. Others were more serious, written during difficult times when words needed to carry weight beyond their ink. One letter, written during the final months of her illness, he read aloud to Whiskey. "My dear Jeremiah, I know you're scared. I am too, but I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, don't let grief make you small. Don't let it convince you that because one beautiful thing has ended, nothing beautiful can ever start again. You've got years ahead of you, and I want them to be full of work you're proud of, friendships that matter, maybe even love if it finds you. Take care of Whiskey. He'll miss me too, and you'll need each other. And remember that carrying me in your heart doesn't mean you have to carry me as weight. Let me be light instead. Let me be the reason you stay open to whatever comes next." Jeremiah's voice had roughed by the end, and he had to pause before continuing. "I didn't do very well with that promise, boy. Spent a lot of years carrying her as weight instead of light. Maybe that's changing now." Whiskey nickered softly, as if in agreement or encouragement. Jeremiah folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. Some promises took longer to keep than others. Some required the right circumstances before they could be honored. The legal process was moving forward, though not as quickly as Jeremiah would have liked. Sheriff Hartley had filed the necessary motions, and a hearing was scheduled for the following week. The evidence seemed solid. The tattoo, combined with Jeremiah's demonstration of knowledge about the horse and the reunion witnessed by dozens of people, made a compelling case. But law had its own pace, and Jeremiah had learned patience through all his years of loss and wandering. What he hadn't expected was the escalation of Garrett's harassment. It started with phone calls. Jeremiah's number, which he'd had to provide for the legal proceedings, somehow ended up in Garrett's possession. The calls came at odd hours, late at night or very early morning, and consisted mostly of threats and accusations. Garrett claimed Jeremiah had stolen his property, had conspired with the sheriff to defraud him, had forged the tattoo somehow to support his false claim. Jeremiah didn't engage. He documented each call time, date, duration, content, and forwarded the information to Sheriff Hartley as instructed. After a week of this, Hartley paid Garrett a visit and warned him that continued harassment would result in charges. The phone calls stopped, but the trouble didn't. Garrett began showing up at the boarding facility, always staying just within legal boundaries, but making his presence felt. He'd park across the road and watch the barn. He'd talk loudly to anyone who'd listen about how the legal system was stacked against honest men. Once, he tried to enter the barn while Jeremiah was there, claiming he had a right to check on his property. Margaret, who dealt with difficult people throughout her career, blocked his path and informed him that he was not welcome on her property and would be trespassing if he didn't leave immediately. "This is harassment," Margaret told Jeremiah after escorting Garrett off the premises. "You need to get a restraining order." After the hearing, Jeremiah replied, "One legal matter at a time," but the stress of it wore on him. He'd spent years avoiding conflict, keeping his head down, moving on when situations got complicated. Having to stand his ground, having to actively fight for something, it was exhausting in ways the physical work of ranching never was. He found himself sleeping poorly, waking in the dark hours with his mind churning through worst-case scenarios. During one particularly difficult night, he drove to the boarding facility long after visiting hours, unable to shake the irrational fear that Garrett might somehow take whiskey, might spirit the horse away, and disappear the way the original thieves had. Margaret, who lived on the property, heard his truck and came out in her bathrobe. "Can't sleep," Jeremiah admitted. "Needed to check." "He's fine," Margaret said, not unkindly. "Come on, I'll walk with you." They went to the barn together, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Whiskey was dozing in his stall, one hip cocked, head lowered in relaxation. He opened his eyes when they approached, blinked sleepily at Jeremiah, then closed them again, completely untroubled. "See," Margaret said. "Safe and sound." Jeremiah nodded, feeling foolish but also relieved. "Sorry for waking you. I've been woken for worse reasons." She studied him in the dim light. "You're running yourself ragged over this. The hearing is in 3 days. Hartley says the judge is fair and your case is solid. You need to trust the process." "I trusted the process 12 years ago," Jeremiah said quietly. "Sheriff tracked those rustlers as far as he could, filed all the right reports, did everything by the book. Didn't get my horse back. This is different. You've got proof now. You've got witnesses. You've got the law on your side instead of working against you." She paused. "And you've got people supporting you. Buck, me, half the folks who were at that auction. You're not alone in this." The words landed with unexpected weight. Jeremiah had gotten so used to being alone, to handling everything himself, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have people in his corner. Buck had given him flexible hours without complaint. Margaret had gone above and beyond in caring for Whiskey and protecting them both from Garrett's intrusions. Even the sheriff, who could have approached the situation with pure bureaucratic detachment, had shown genuine concern for getting things right. "Thank you," Jeremiah said, "for all of it." Margaret waved off the gratitude. "Go back to Buck's and get some sleep. Your horse will still be here in the morning, and you need to be sharp for the hearing." Jeremiah drove back through the quiet darkness, her words replaying in his mind. Sarah had told him not to let grief make him small, not to close himself off to connection and community. For 12 years, he'd been doing exactly that, keeping himself isolated, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or build relationships. Maybe that was changing. Maybe finding Whiskey again was opening doors he'd thought permanently closed. 3 more days until the hearing. 3 more days until the law would decide whether the connection between man and horse was enough to overcome paperwork and procedure. Jeremiah lay in his bunk that night, not sleeping but not fighting wakefulness either, and tried to believe that this time the outcome would be different. The day before the hearing, a woman appeared at the boarding facility, asking to see Jeremiah. Margaret came to find him in Whiskey's stall, where he was working saddle soap into an old bridle he'd purchased in town. "Visitor for you," Margaret said. "Says her name is Elena Vasquez. She's been looking for you since she heard about the auction." Jeremiah set down the bridle and stepped out of the stall, wiping his hands on a rag. The woman waiting in the barn aisle was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that carried both warmth and something heavier, grief, maybe, or the memory of it. "Mr. Pickett," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I live up near the Montana border, run a small operation with my husband. I heard about what happened at the auction, and She paused, seeming to gather herself. "I needed to meet you and see the horse, if that's all right." "You know Whiskey?" Jeremiah asked, surprised. "I knew him as Red," Elena said. "That's what we called him. He was with us for almost 3 years." Jeremiah felt the world tilt slightly. 3 years. He'd spent 12 years not knowing where Whiskey had been, imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios. Now here was someone who could fill in at least part of that missing time. "Tell me," he said. They sat on hay bales in the barn aisle, while Elena told her story. 8 years ago, her husband Miguel had been working as a ranch hand for a livestock dealer near the Canadian border. The dealer, a man named Hutchins, had a sideline in buying and selling horses with questionable provenance. Miguel hadn't known this when he took the job, and by the time he figured it out, he was in too deep to easily extricate himself. "Hutchins brought in a sorrel stallion one day," Elena said. "Beautiful horse, but wild with fear. He'd been handled rough, kept in terrible conditions. Hutchins planned to sell him quick, but the horse was so aggressive nobody wanted him. Miguel convinced Hutchins to let him try working with him instead of sending him to slaughter." Jeremiah's hands tightened on his knees at the word slaughter, but he kept listening. "Miguel has a way with damaged horses," Elena continued. "Patient, gentle. It took months, but eventually the stallion Red, we called him, began to trust again. Miguel would spend hours just sitting in the paddock with him, not asking anything, just being present. Slowly, the horse came around." She pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her purse and handed it to Jeremiah. The paper was yellowed with age, the date stamp showing it was from 5 years ago. The headline read, "Horse Saves Child from Mountain Lion Attack." Jeremiah's breath caught as he read the article. A 6-year-old boy, the Vasquez's nephew, had been playing near the edge of their property when a mountain lion appeared from the tree line. Before anyone could react, the sorrel horse Red had charged between the child and the predator, screaming and striking with his hooves, driving the lion back into the forest. The boy was unharmed. The horse had sustained minor injuries, but had likely saved the child's life. "That was Whiskey?" Jeremiah asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That was Red. That was your Whiskey." Elena's eyes shimmered with tears. "After that, he was family to us. Miguel quit working for Hutchins. We couldn't stay connected to that operation anymore, not with what we'd learned about where the horses were coming from. We bought Red from Hutchins, paid what little we had, and brought him home to our own place." "What happened? Why did you let him go?" Elena's face crumpled slightly. "We didn't let him go. Miguel died 3 years ago, heart attack in the field. Completely unexpected. I tried to keep the operation going, but without him," she shook her head, "I couldn't manage it, couldn't afford the feed, couldn't do the work. I had to sell most of the animals. A man came by, said he ran a boarding stable, seemed legitimate. He offered a fair price for Red and promised he'd have a good home. I was desperate. I needed the money. I trusted him." "Dale Garrett," Jeremiah said. "Yes. I didn't know if I'd known what kind of place he was running, how he'd treat the animals." Her voice broke. "When I heard about the auction, about a sorrel horse with scars and a man claiming him after 12 years, I had to come. Had to see if it was Red. Had to tell you what kind of horse you got back." She reached out and gripped Jeremiah's hand. "Your horse saved my nephew's life. He was brave and good, even after everything he'd been through. Even after being stolen and mistreated, he still had that instinct to protect. Miguel loved him, said he was the best horse he'd ever worked with." Jeremiah couldn't speak. The article trembled in his hands as he read it again, trying to absorb what this meant. During the years Whiskey had been lost to him, the horse hadn't just survived, he'd saved a child's life, had found people who loved him, had been given a name and a purpose and care. The narrative he'd carried in his head of whiskey suffering continuously, abandoned and forgotten, was incomplete. There had been light in the darkness, moments of connection and heroism. "Can I see him?" Elena asked. I'd like to say goodbye properly. I didn't get to, when I sold him to Garrett." Jeremiah led her to Whiskey's stall. The horse raised his head when they approached, ears forward with interest at the new visitor. Elena made a soft sound and reached out slowly, letting Whiskey smell her hand before touching his face. "Hey there, Red," she said softly. "Look at you. You're going home, aren't you? Back to where you started." Whiskey leaned into her touch, and Jeremiah saw recognition in the gesture. This woman had been part of the horse's life, part of his story during the lost years. She represented something Jeremiah hadn't been able to give him: a bridge between the trauma of being stolen and the redemption of being found. "I brought something," Elena said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a faded red halter, soft with age and use. "Miguel's. He used this when he was working with Red. I thought maybe you'd want it. A piece of the time between." Jeremiah took the halter, running his fingers over the worn leather. It smelled of horse and sweat, and the particular combination of dust and care that accumulated in working tack. This halter had been on Whiskey's head hundreds of times, had been part of his healing process after trauma, had been held by hands that had shown him patience and gentleness. "Thank you," Jeremiah managed to say, "for taking care of him, for loving him." "Thank you for finding him," Elena replied, "for not giving up." Miguel used to say that horse was waiting for something, like he knew he was supposed to be somewhere else. Maybe he was waiting to get back to you. After Elena left, Jeremiah sat alone in the barn, with the halter in his hands and the newspaper clipping in his pocket. The story he'd been telling himself for 12 years, a story of loss and abandonment and suffering, had just become more complicated. Yes, Whiskey had suffered. Yes, he'd been stolen and passed through rough hands and ended up in a terrible situation with Garrett. But he'd also been loved by the Vasquezes. He'd been a hero. He'd been Red before he could be Whiskey again. That night, Jeremiah took the newspaper clipping and the red halter back to the bunkhouse. He laid them out next to the photograph of Sarah and Whiskey, creating a small shrine to the journey they'd all taken. Sarah, who died believing Whiskey was safe. Whiskey, who'd lived a whole life in the years between. And Jeremiah himself, who'd spent 12 years wandering without knowing if healing was even possible. The hearing was tomorrow. Judge would decide if the legal proof was sufficient, if the tattoo and the testimony and the obvious bond between man and horse outweighed Garrett's paperwork and possession. But regardless of what the law decided, Jeremiah now knew something crucial. Whiskey hadn't spent 12 years waiting passively to be rescued. He'd lived. He'd connected with other people. He'd saved a child's life. He'd been resilient and brave, and had kept that spark of goodness despite everything. If Whiskey could do that, could survive and adapt, and still remain fundamentally himself, then maybe Jeremiah could too. Maybe it wasn't too late to honor Sarah's request, to let grief be light instead of weight, to stay open to whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, sitting in a spare bunkhouse with pieces of the past and present spread before him, Jeremiah felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope that was grounded not in wishful thinking, but in evidence. Evidence that beautiful things could endure. Evidence that connection could survive separation. Evidence that home, however long the journey, was still worth finding. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the kind of crystalline autumn day that made everything feel sharper, more present. Jeremiah woke before dawn, as was his habit, but lay in the bunk for a long moment before rising, gathering his thoughts and his nerve for what lay ahead. He dressed carefully in clothes he'd purchased specifically for the occasion: a clean white shirt, pressed jeans without patches or stains, a sports coat that Buck had insisted he borrow. "Judge needs to see you're serious," Buck had said. "Needs to see you're not just some drifter making claims." Jeremiah understood the logic, even if the clothes felt foreign on his body, like wearing someone else's skin. Buck drove him to the courthouse, neither man speaking much during the journey. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just two men who understood that some moments were too weighted for casual conversation. The radio played quietly, some country station out of Cheyenne, songs about heartbreak and homecoming that seemed oddly appropriate. "You nervous?" Buck asked, as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot. "Been nervous for 12 years, Jeremiah replied. "Today's just when I find out if nervous was worth it." Sheriff Hartley met them at the courthouse steps, a manila folder thick with documents under his arm. He looked official and serious in his full uniform, badge polished to a high shine. "Morning, Jeremiah. You ready?" "As I'll ever be." "Good. We've got a strong case. Judge Kimball is fair. She'll look at the evidence and make her decision based on facts, not emotion. That works in our favor." He gestured toward the entrance. "Garrett's already inside with his lawyer. Man named Phillips, handles a lot of small claims and property disputes. He's going to argue that possession is 9/10 of the law, that Garrett bought in good faith, and that you abandoned your property by not pursuing recovery more aggressively." Jeremiah felt his jaw tighten. "I filed a police report. Sheriff tracked the thieves as far as possible. What more was I supposed to do?" "I know, and we'll make that clear. But Phillips will push the angle that 12 years is too long, that at some point unclaimed property becomes the possession of whoever has it." Hartley paused. "He's also going to try to discredit the reunion moment at the auction. Call it theatrics. Suggest you trained the horse to respond that way, imply the whole thing was staged. How do you stage a horse recognizing his owner after 12 years? You don't, but Phillips will try to make the judge doubt what everyone saw. That's his job." Hartley opened the door and held it. "Our job is to present evidence so solid that doubt isn't possible." The courtroom was smaller than Jeremiah expected, wood-paneled and formal, but not intimidating. A handful of people sat in the gallery. Buck, Margaret from the boarding facility, a few faces Jeremiah recognized from the auction. And sitting on the opposite side, Dale Garrett with his lawyer, both men wearing expensive suits and expressions of confident superiority. Garrett caught Jeremiah's eye and smirked, a gesture clearly meant to unnerve. Jeremiah looked away, refusing to engage. Let the man have his moment of false confidence. The truth would speak soon enough. Judge Patricia Kimball entered through a side door, and everyone rose. She was perhaps 60, with steel-grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that suggested she'd heard every possible excuse and variation of human conflict. She took her seat, arranged papers on her desk, and looked up with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply attentive. "This is a motion for return of property seized during the enforcement of animal welfare statutes," she began, her voice clear and precise. "Mr. Pickett claims ownership of a horse currently in temporary custody, claims that predate Mr. Garrett's documented possession. Mr. Garrett contests this claim and asserts his legal right to the animal based on purchase and 5 years of ownership. We're here to determine the facts and render a decision." She looked to Garrett's lawyer. "Mr. Phillips, you may present your case." Phillips stood, buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture that seemed more theatrical than necessary. He was younger than Jeremiah expected, maybe 35, with the kind of polished appearance that came from spending more time in offices than outdoors. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. My client, Dale Garrett, purchased the horse in question 5 years ago from a licensed livestock dealer in Montana. He has a bill of sale, proof of payment, and documentation of the animal's care during his ownership." Phillips pulled papers from his folder and approached the bench. "He's invested time, money, and resources into this horse. He acted in good faith, believing he was acquiring property legally." "And the claim that the horse was stolen prior to that purchase?" Judge Kimball asked. "Unsubstantiated. Mr. Pickett filed a police report 12 years ago, yes. But he made no subsequent effort to locate the animal, placed no advertisements, contacted no recovery services. For all practical purposes, he abandoned the search. When property is abandoned for such an extended period, the law recognizes that possession by another party, acquired in good faith, takes precedence. Judge Kimball made notes, her expression unreadable. Continue. Furthermore, Your Honor, the dramatic scene at the auction, while certainly emotional, doesn't constitute legal proof of ownership. Horses respond to many handlers, to familiar sounds and gestures. Without documentation, without verifiable identification, Mr. Pickett's claim amounts to, "I want this horse," not "I can prove this horse is mine." Phillips spent another 10 minutes building his case, emphasizing the length of time that had passed, the money Garrett had spent, the principle that good faith purchasers deserved protection under the law. He made it sound reasonable, logical, as if allowing Jeremiah to reclaim whiskey would somehow undermine the entire foundation of property rights. Jeremiah listened with growing tension, watching the judge's face for any indication of how the arguments were landing. She gave nothing away, simply took notes, and asked occasional clarifying questions. When Phillips finished, Judge Kimball turned to Sheriff Hartley. "And your response?" Hartley stood, and unlike Phillips, there was nothing theatrical in his bearing, just solid competence and evident respect for the court's process. "Your Honor, the key piece of evidence is permanent identification that predates Mr. Garrett's purchase. Inside the horse's upper lip is a tattoo, a date, July 23rd, 1948. This is not a registration number or standard marking. It's a personal identifier placed there by Mr. Pickett." He approached the bench with photographs. These were taken at the boarding facility where the horse is currently housed. The tattoo is clearly visible and has been verified by a veterinarian. I've also obtained a sworn statement from Mr. Pickett's longtime friend, Buck Hensley, confirming that Mr. Pickett told him about marking the horse this way and confirming the date's significance. It's Mr. Pickett's late wife's birthday. Judge Kimball studied the photographs carefully. "When was this tattoo allegedly placed?" "Approximately 7 years before the theft," Hartley said. 5 years after Mrs. Pickett's death. Mr. Pickett marked the horse to ensure he would never sell it, as it represented his last connection to his wife. The tattoo was already present when the horse was stolen, meaning it was present when Mr. Garrett purchased the animal. If Mr. Garrett or the dealer had performed due diligence in examining the horse, they would have discovered this marking. "The tattoo could have been placed any time," Phillips interjected. "There's no way to prove when it was done." "Actually, there is," Hartley said. He gestured toward the gallery. "I've brought a witness who can testify to the tattoo's age and circumstances." Elena Vasquez stood, moving to the front of the courtroom. She'd come at Hartley's request after Jeremiah told him about her visit. Now she looked directly at the judge, her bearing calm despite obvious nervousness. "Your Honor, my name is Elena Vasquez. The horse in question was in my family's possession for 3 years, about 8 years ago. My late husband acquired him from a dealer named Hutchins, and we called him Red. When we first got him, I assisted in veterinary care. I personally saw the tattoo inside his lip and asked my husband about it. He said it was already there when the dealer brought the horse in, that Hutchins had mentioned it was some kind of personal mark from a previous owner." "And you're certain about the time frame?" Judge Kimball asked. "Completely certain. We had Red from 8 years ago until 5 years ago, when I had to sell him due to financial hardship after my husband's death. The tattoo was present the entire time." Phillips tried to object, to question Elena's memory or motives, but Judge Kimball silenced him with a raised hand. She was studying the photographs again, cross-referencing them with the timeline Elena had provided. "Is there any other evidence?" the judge asked. "The reunion itself," Hartley said. 37 witnesses saw Mr. Pickett interact with this horse for the first time in 12 years. The horse responded to a specific 3-note melody that Mr. Pickett used to calm him during storms, a melody taught to him by his late wife. The horse immediately recognized both the sound and the man, showing behavior consistent with deep familiarity despite the length of separation. "Witnesses can be swayed by emotion," Phillips said. "They see what they want to see. Your Honor, I was one of those witnesses," Hartley said quietly. I went into that situation skeptical, expecting to prove the old man wrong so we could finish the auction. What I saw was undeniable recognition between horse and handler. It wasn't trained behavior or coincidence. It was reunion. Judge Kimball sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. The courtroom had gone silent, everyone waiting for her to process the evidence and arguments. Jeremiah's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd put everything on the table, the tattoo, the testimony, the obvious bond. If it wasn't enough, if the law decided that paperwork outweighed truth, then he'd lose whiskey again, this time with no hope of recovery. Buck reached over and squeezed Jeremiah's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Margaret sat with her hands folded, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Even Elena, who had no stake in the outcome beyond wanting what was right, leaned forward in her seat, invested in the conclusion of a story she'd been part of without knowing it. "I need to ask you something, Mr. Pickett," Judge Kimball said finally, her eyes finding Jeremiah's face. "Why didn't you keep searching? 12 years is a long time to let something go, if it truly mattered." Jeremiah stood, his legs unsteady but holding. The question felt like an accusation, but he understood it was necessary. The judge needed to know if his claim was genuine or opportunistic, if the horse really represented something irreplaceable, or if this was about winning a contest of wills with Garrett. "Your Honor, I never stopped searching," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Every ranch I worked, every town I passed through, I looked at the horses. Kept hoping I'd see him, recognize something, the way he moved, the shape of his head, anything. But when years go by, and there's nothing, no leads, no sightings, no hope, you start to accept that some losses are permanent. I kept moving because staying still in the life we'd built together, without him or my wife, was too painful. But I never forgot. I never stopped hoping. And when I saw him at that auction, I knew. 12 years or 12 days. Doesn't matter. Some bonds don't break." The courtroom stayed silent. Judge Kimball's expression had softened slightly, showing the human being beneath the judicial authority. Judge Kimball set down her pen and looked out over the courtroom. The weight of her decision seemed to settle visibly on her shoulders, not because the law was unclear, but because she understood what hung in the balance. This wasn't just about property rights or legal technicalities. It was about connection, about whether the systems humans created to order their lives could account for the deeper truths of how they loved and lost, and sometimes, improbably, found again. "Mr. Phillips," she said, "your argument regarding good faith purchase has merit in many situations. The law does protect buyers who acquire property legally and without knowledge of prior claims. However," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "that protection assumes that reasonable due diligence was performed. A permanent identifying mark inside the horse's mouth is not something a competent buyer or seller would overlook during a standard veterinary examination or basic inspection." Philip started to speak, but the judge held up her hand. "Furthermore, the nature of the identification is significant. This isn't a registration number or standard marking that could be confused with commercial identification. It's a date-specific, personal, and with verifiable significance to Mr. Pickett's life. The probability that someone would randomly tattoo that particular date inside a horse's lip is vanishingly small." She looked at the photographs again, then at Elena Vasquez. Mrs. Vasquez's testimony establishes that the tattoo existed at least 8 years ago, long before Mr. Garrett's purchase and after Mr. Pickett's reported theft. This creates a chain of evidence that supports Mr. Pickett's claim. Garrett shifted in his seat, his confident smirk replaced by something harder, more defensive. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Phillips's expression suggested he knew which way the wind was blowing. "Your Honor, with respect, the emotional testimony about reunions and melodies," Phillips tried again, "is consistent with the physical evidence," Judge Kimball interrupted. "Alone, it might be insufficient. Combined with the tattoo, Mrs. Vasquez's testimony, and the documented theft report from 12 years ago, it forms a compelling case. More importantly, Mr. Garrett has failed to provide any evidence that contradicts Mr. Pickett's claim. He has a bill of sale from a dealer who acquired the horse through questionable channels. That bill of sale does not supersede prior ownership, especially when that ownership can be substantiated. She straightened the papers on her desk, a gesture that felt final. The law is clear on this point. Stolen property does not become legitimately owned simply through the passage of time or good faith purchase from an illegitimate seller. A thief cannot convey good title, and neither can someone who purchases from a thief, knowingly or unknowingly. Jeremiah felt something break loose in his chest, not grief this time, but its opposite, relief so profound it bordered on pain. He gripped the edge of the table in front of him, afraid that if he let go, he might float away or collapse or do something equally undignified in a court of law. Buck's hand found his shoulder again, gripping harder now, sharing the moment. Margaret was crying quietly in the gallery, not bothering to wipe away tears. Elena sat with one hand pressed to her heart, smiling through her own tears at the rightness of what was unfolding. "There's one more consideration," Judge Kimball continued, and Jeremiah's brief elation checked itself, wary of some final complication. "Mr. Garrett, you purchased this horse 5 years ago. During that time, you were responsible for its care and welfare. The evidence presented by the sheriff indicates that the conditions at your facility were inadequate, multiple animals seized for neglect, documented violations of animal welfare statutes." Garrett's face flushed dark red, and he started to stand, but his lawyer pulled him back down. "This court's primary concern is the welfare of the animal in question," the judge said. "Even if your claim of ownership had been legitimate, the evidence of neglect would have been grounds for removal. As it stands, you have neither legitimate ownership nor a record of adequate care." She picked up her gavel, and in that moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The people in the courtroom, the building itself, maybe the whole turning world. This was the moment. This was where 12 years of loss either ended or extended indefinitely into a future Jeremiah couldn't bear to imagine. "Based on the evidence presented," Judge Kimball said, her voice formal but not unkind, "I find that Jeremiah Pickett has sufficiently proven prior ownership of the horse in question. The tattoo, combined with witness testimony and the documented theft report, establishes a clear chain of ownership that predates Mr. Garrett's purchase. Furthermore, Mr. Garrett's acquisition was from a source that could not convey legitimate title to stolen property." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed both quiet and enormous, final and beginning, ending and opening all at once. "The horse is hereby returned to the custody of Jeremiah Pickett, effective immediately. Mr. Garrett, you have the right to pursue restitution from the dealer who sold you the animal, but you have no claim against Mr. Pickett or the horse. This matter is closed." The courtroom erupted. People were standing, some applauding, others simply making sounds of approval or relief. Garrett was on his feet, his lawyer trying to restrain him as he shouted something about appeals and injustice. But his voice was drowned out by the general commotion, by the celebration of something rare, the law and justice actually aligning, truth winning out over procedure. Jeremiah couldn't move. He sat frozen in his chair, the gavel's sound still echoing in his ears, trying to understand that it was over, really over. Whiskey was his again. Not through luck or charity or temporary custody, but through legal recognition of what had always been true. Buck pulled Jeremiah to his feet, and suddenly people were surrounding them, Margaret hugging him fiercely, Elena gripping his hand and saying something he couldn't quite hear through the noise and emotion, strangers from the auction shaking his shoulder or offering congratulations. Sheriff Hartley stood at a slight distance, his professional demeanor cracked by a genuine smile, waiting for the initial commotion to die down. Through the crowd, Jeremiah saw Garrett being escorted out by his lawyer, still arguing, still refusing to accept what had happened. But his protests had no weight anymore, no authority. The law had spoken, and for once, the law had gotten it right. "Congratulations," Hartley said when he could finally reach Jeremiah. He held out a folder of papers, release documents, transfer of custody, official stamps and signatures that transformed legal theory into practical reality. "These are yours. Soon as you sign them, you can take the horse home, wherever home is. Home." The word hit Jeremiah with unexpected force. For 12 years, home had been wherever he laid his head for the night, bunkhouses, cheap motels, occasionally his truck when money was tight. He'd avoided permanence, convinced that nothing he built would last, that loss was inevitable, so why bother creating anything worth losing? But now he had whiskey back. And whiskey needed more than temporary quarters and borrowed stalls. He needed a place to heal, to rebuild strength, to simply exist without the constant uncertainty of what came next. Which meant Jeremiah needed those things too. "I don't know where that is yet," Jeremiah admitted, "but I'll figure it out. Buck's got that little place behind his barn," Buck said, as if the decision had already been made. "Not fancy, but it's got 2 stalls, a tack room, and a paddock. More than adequate for 1 horse and 1 stubborn old man. You're welcome to it. Long as you need." Jeremiah turned to his friend, throat tight, with gratitude he didn't know how to express. Buck waved off the unspoken thanks. "You'll earn your keep same as always. I can always use good help. And besides," he paused, his weathered face softening, "you've been wandering long enough, old bones. Time to stop." Margaret approached with practical concerns. "He'll need a few more days of monitoring before he's ready to move. Let me make sure his nutrition is stable, get the farrier out to properly trim those hooves. Then he's all yours." "Thank you," Jeremiah managed, "for everything. Just doing what's right," she smiled, "though I'll miss having him around. He's a good soul, that horse. Despite everything, he kept his goodness." Elena was the last to say goodbye. She pressed something into Jeremiah's hand, a photograph, creased and faded, but clear enough. It showed Miguel standing with whiskey, the horse's head over the man's shoulder, both of them looking peaceful and content. On the back, written in careful script, "Red and Miguel, 2018. He saved us in more ways than one." "Keep it," Elena said when Jeremiah tried to return it. "It's part of his story, part of your story now too. Miguel would want you to know that the years in between weren't all darkness. There was light, there was love, there was purpose." Jeremiah held the photograph carefully, adding it to the collection of artifacts that traced Whiskey's journey. Sarah's picture from 20 years ago, the red halter from Miguel's care, the newspaper clipping about the mountain lion, and now this image of peace in the middle of chaos. Each piece told part of a larger story about resilience and connection, and the mysterious ways that love persisted through time and distance. The courthouse emptied slowly, people drifting back to their lives with something to talk about over dinner, a story about an old cowboy and his horse that would be retold and embellished until it took on the weight of legend. But for Jeremiah, walking out into the afternoon sun with papers clutched in his hand and Buck beside him, it wasn't legend. It was simply truth, hard-won, long delayed, but finally absolutely true. They drove to the boarding facility together, Buck maintaining a respectful silence while Jeremiah processed everything that had happened. The hearing had taken less than 2 hours from start to finish, but it felt like a lifetime had passed between entering that courtroom and leaving it. He was different now, fundamentally changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. Whiskey was waiting in his stall, head over the gate, ears forward in anticipation. Somehow he knew, whether from recognizing Jeremiah's truck or simply sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, that something important had changed. When Jeremiah approached, the horse nickered that particular sound of greeting that was reserved for true belonging. "Hey there, boy," Jeremiah said, his voice breaking on the words. "We won. You're mine again. Officially, legally, permanently mine." He opened the stall door and stepped inside, and Whiskey moved to him immediately, pressing his big head against Jeremiah's chest in that gesture that had become their signature reunion. Jeremiah wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and let himself cry, really cry, not the contained emotion of the courtroom, but the full release of 12 years of grief and loss and stubborn hope that had finally been vindicated. Buck stood outside the stall, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to bear witness. When Jeremiah finally pulled back, wiping at his face with shaking hands, Buck spoke quietly. "Sarah would be proud of you, for not giving up, for fighting for what mattered. I should have fought harder, sooner." "You fought exactly as hard as you were able to," Buck interrupted. "That's all any of us can do. And in the end, you won. That's what counts." Jeremiah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He turned back to Whiskey, running his hands over the horse's face, memorizing every detail as if the separation might still somehow reverse itself, but it wouldn't. The papers in his pocket guaranteed it. The law had given him back what had been stolen, and more than that, had acknowledged that some things, some connections, were worth fighting for, regardless of time or difficulty. "Few more days," he told Whiskey. "Then we go home. Real home, not temporary quarters. A place where we can both finally rest." The horse's response was to lean into him again, and Jeremiah felt the last piece of tension he'd been carrying finally release. They'd made it through. Both of them, scarred and older, but fundamentally intact. The journey wasn't over. There was still healing to do, adjustments to make, a future to build from the wreckage of the past. But they'd face it together, the way they should have all along. 3 months after the hearing, on a morning when frost painted intricate patterns on the paddock fence, Jeremiah stood with a new leather halter in his hands, watching Whiskey graze in the pale sunlight. The horse had filled out considerably under regular feeding and proper care. His coat gleamed copper-red again, the dullness gone, replaced by the shine that spoke of good health and contentment. The scars remained. They would always remain, but they'd become part of his story rather than the whole of it. The small barn behind Buck's property had become their sanctuary. Jeremiah had spent weeks making it exactly right, repairing boards, installing better drainage, building a feed room where everything stayed dry and organized. He'd hung Sarah's photograph in the tack room, along with the picture of Miguel and Whiskey, creating a gallery of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The red halter from Miguel hung on a hook beside the new one he'd just purchased, a symbol of honoring the past while building toward the future. Whiskey raised his head from grazing and looked toward Jeremiah, ears forward with interest. The wariness that had characterized him at the auction was gone. He moved with ease now, the limp caused by poor hoof care corrected by a skilled farrier. His eyes carried the alertness of a horse who felt safe, who knew he was home. "Come here, boy," Jeremiah called softly. The horse walked across the paddock without hesitation, stopping in front of Jeremiah and lowering his head to investigate the new halter. It was simple but well made, leather the color of old saddles, brass hardware that would age with use. Jeremiah had spent more than he probably should have, but some things deserved investment. This halter would last, and so would they. He slipped it over Whiskey's head, adjusting the fit carefully. The horse stood quietly, accepting the new equipment with the patience of an animal who understood that this person could be trusted with such things. When Jeremiah finished, Whiskey shook his head once, testing the feel of it, then nuzzled Jeremiah's pocket, looking for the apple slices he'd learned were usually there. "Spoiled," Jeremiah said affectionately, producing the expected treat. "Getting soft in your old age." Buck appeared from the main barn, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Jeremiah and leaned against the fence, watching Whiskey crunch through his apple with evident satisfaction. "Horse looks good," Buck observed. "You both do." It was true. Jeremiah had gained back some of the weight he'd lost during years of drifting, his face less gaunt, his movements less weary. He'd stopped moving through life like a ghost passing through rooms, had started engaging with the present instead of just enduring it. The work at Buck's ranch had become more than just employment. It was purpose, community, the foundation for building something that would last. "Been thinking," Jeremiah said, sipping his coffee, "about getting a few more horses, not to breed professionally or anything ambitious, just good horses that need homes. Ones that have been through rough situations, need patient handling." Buck nodded slowly. "You've got the space if we extend the paddock, and you've certainly got the skill. Lord knows there's no shortage of horses needing second chances." "Whiskey taught me something," Jeremiah said, "about resilience, about how damage doesn't have to be permanent. He went through hell, but he kept his goodness. Saved that boy, connected with Miguel and Elena, still had enough trust left to recognize me after 12 years. If he can do that, maybe other horses can too. And maybe other people," Buck said quietly. Jeremiah smiled. "Yeah, maybe that too." They stood in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching Whiskey explore his paddock with the casual confidence of ownership. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in the cold air. In the distance, the mountains wore their first dusting of winter snow, stark and beautiful against the blue sky. Sarah's letter had asked him not to let grief make him small, not to close himself off to possibility. For 12 years he'd failed that request, had let loss define him, had chosen wandering over connection. But finding Whiskey had changed something fundamental, had opened doors he'd thought permanently closed. He wasn't the same man who'd stood at that auction, desperate and uncertain. He'd fought for what mattered and won. He'd accepted help from friends and strangers. He'd learned that home wasn't a place you lost, it was something you built, day by day, from whatever materials you had available. "Thank you," Jeremiah said, "for letting me stay, for the work, the space, all of it." Buck waved off the gratitude the way he always did. "Best hand I've had in years. You're doing me the favor." But they both knew it was more than that. Buck had given Jeremiah something more valuable than employment. He'd given him the chance to stop running, to put down roots, to discover whether the life he'd lost could be rebuilt in a different form. The answer, it turned out, was yes. Not the same life, not the exact replica of what he'd had with Sarah, but something new and worthwhile, built on the foundation of what came before. Whiskey finished his apple and came to stand beside Jeremiah, resting his head on the old man's shoulder in that gesture that never failed to move him. Jeremiah reached up and scratched behind the horse's ears, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute reality of his presence. Some bonds really did run deeper than time. Some connections survived years of separation, miles of distance, and all the damage the world could inflict. The horse standing beside him was proof of that. The friends who'd supported him, the strangers who'd helped, the community that had formed around this story, all of it proved that beautiful things could endure, that home was always worth finding, and that second chances, however unlikely, were sometimes real. In the remote mountains of Wyoming, an old cowboy and his recovered horse had found their way back to each other. The journey had been long and marked by loss and difficulty, but they'd made it through to something better than mere survival. They'd found peace, they'd found purpose, they'd found home. And that, Jeremiah thought, watching the morning sun climb higher in the clear sky, was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Whiskey nickered softly, a sound of contentment that needed no translation. Jeremiah smiled and turned toward the barn, the horse following without command or hesitation, both of them moving together into whatever came next, finally and absolutely where they belonged.